challenge with Australia is that we've got 6 states, 2 territories and a federal government. And each of those jurisdictions have got valuable data. And of course, our extra challenge in Australia is that we're in a federation, so the federal government has got some data and the states have other health data, and to really bring that data together, we need to be able to link it. And that's been a challenge for Australia, I think. And PHIN's tried to tackle that with a lot of conversations. So we've had to talk to the various people in the linkage units, the data custodians. And as a result of those conversations, we've been able to develop something called an online application system. So researchers, wherever they are in Australia, can come into this single approach, this single platform, and apply for data. And then the staff in PHN are able to coordinate those conversations and help the researcher actually get their data, because there are many different approvals required. And I think that's part of the data landscape in Australia.
Yeah, and I suppose, looking at it, the same issue from the UK perspective, it's similar but not the same. So if you live and work in England, you wouldn't even think there was a problem of jurisdictional data linkage, because of course England predominates in the UK, in a way in which, as I understand it, no single state or territory does in Australia. However, there are 4 distinct autonomous devolved administrations in the UK, England only being 1, and then Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales being the other 3, smaller admittedly. And so what we see is fragmentation, particularly in England, of data holdings and custodianship, but they're not a jurisdictional issues, they're more a custodian-based fragmentation. And the biggest drive there is to try and create facilities that for a researcher allows them to access this distributed data conveniently and at scale, so they don't have to put through multiple applications and all that stuff. So the online system in Australia is a great step forward. But I think we're less advanced in the UK at really addressing the whole UK issue. But it has been recognised. And so I think the UK's first, perhaps not first, but certainly earliest efforts are really less concerned about trying to reconcile patient identities across jurisdictions for cross-border flows, for example, but more to kind of unblock the barriers for simultaneous access to data repositories. I think the first stage here is, can we show that we can make it easier for a researcher, irrespective of where they're cited, to get data scaled across jurisdictions and within a fragmented English picture. And if we can create the mechanism that does that, we've demonstrated we can make a big difference. I think secondarily becomes the issue of reconciling identities across those and kind of finding the same people who have been recorded twice. Very important to do, but that is really not really being focused on just yet. So our work and the work of colleagues in the UK really is focusing on about how can we just break down the barriers of access and application to the point where it's feasible to do the same study in several different jurisdictions, but essentially as one operation from wherever you're based.
I think the challenge for Australia is we've had to do it. Because half of the health data is held in the Commonwealth and the other half's held in the states and territories. So we've sort of been forced to, in a sense. And I think our colleagues in Canada, while they're interested in doing that sort of linkage, haven't had quite the same problem, because within a Canadian province, they have all that data. They have the primary care, secondary care, tertiary healthcare data, plus a lot of other human services data, whereas Australia isn't that fortunate.
No.
And so it's a bit of a challenge for us and something that we've really been forced to respond to. And I think we're not the only country that's a federation. We do have colleagues in Germany, and I think they've got 16 states, so it's an even bigger challenge for them. But I think we have made some good progress. We've still got a way to go.
I mean, it's so I understand the Australian picture, and as I said before, it's slightly different from England. So I suppose England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, Scotland are a little bit more like Canada in that they have complete jurisdiction over their healthcare systems. Australia is, as you've said, more complicated. But how much does the sort of legal landscape of those different states and territories in Australia, make it easier or difficult? Is forget political or anything else, just the legal landscape, does that really get in the way?
Well, I think the legal landscape is a challenge. I think it's complicated wherever you go, but it's probably quite complicated in Australia because, of course, whatever we do needs to be lawful. And there is many different pieces of legislation within each jurisdiction. And most jurisdictions have privacy legislation, some have health records legislation, some have freedom of information legislation, and others have underlying legislation or regulations that actually cover the collection of the data and the use of the data. And that can be data such as cancer registry data or hospital admitted patient or separations data. And there's a lot of variation. So to really you need to find a pathway through that. And I think the approach to data release in the UK is different, whereas here each project needs to be approved with ethics committee approval and custodian approval, and that generally requires a detailed review. Whereas I have a sense in the UK, it may be the Calder Cup principles or some other framework, where of course there's scrutiny, but it probably isn't quite at the level at which it is in Australia.
So I think you're quite right, I think there is a difference. I mean, certainly in the UK, there has been, and there continues to be, only one privacy legislation in place across the UK. Scotland has the ability to have different law, and it does have different law in some circumstances, but largely privacy is uniform, the legal situation. And that's, I think actually it's a legacy of our involvement with the European Union, because the privacy law in the UK the old privacy law was predicated on a European directive that came out, and so we took that into the UK and made it UK scaled law. And more recently, you may have heard the general data protection regulations came into force in the UK. And of course, that affects all member states, whether you're Scotland or not. So we have completely uniform law. And that will remain the case, I think, if and when we exit the European Union. We're not talking about that today, are we?
No, I don't think so.
In fact, this is a kind of an artifact. It's a really good thing, I think. Really, it's removed some of the potential challenges that you wrestle with here in Australia from the UK. But what we do have is at least in the 4 jurisdictions, and in fact within the different organisations and custodian settings in England too, we do have different mechanisms at play. So and different appetites and different approaches. So although the law is the same, it kind of hovers at quite a high level. And then when you get down below that law is interpreted and it's kind of institutionalised in different ways, which aren't the same. So it's perhaps a lesser problem than having different law, but it gets in the way of doing things together because we all have different processes and different policies and we've operationalised it differently.
Yes, well, I think that's a useful insight because for us the legislation adds complexity, but it's not the only issue. I think there are issues at the same situation that you have where it's at a policy level.
Yeah.
So the legislation, of course, is sometimes black and white and sometimes it's at a higher level and perhaps not quite so black and white, and it's subject to interpretation.
Yeah.
And that interpretation varies between organisations and even in a single organisation at a time. And somehow we have to find a pathway through all that.
Can I ask you a question? So just as a thought experiment, really. We in the UK, and indeed any member state of Europe, had the new general data protection regulations enforced on us, with greater or lesser degrees of squealing about it. But nevertheless, it just happened, and it caused us all to try and adjust ourselves in order to be compliant. Would this be something that would be useful to happen in Australia for whatever reason? Would a unifying data protection legislation or a permissive one, an enabling one, would that be possible? Would it be desirable?
Well, that's a very good question, David, because at the moment our federal government is looking at a data sharing and release legislation. So they've had an issues paper. We and many other people around the country have commented on it. And I think that's the beginning of a step in that sort of direction. that came out of Australia's got a productivity commission. The productivity commission looked into the issue of data sharing and release and was concerned with the way in which things were managed in Australia and suggested some changes to the regulatory regime. So there is currently in Australia at this point in time, towards the end of 2018, consultation now. But having said that, I've seen a lot of legislation over the years, and there often isn't a silver bullet, and perhaps arguably there shouldn't be a silver bullet. Maybe there needs to be clarity. I'd be much more comfortable, I think, if there was more clarity on what could be done and what couldn't be done, and then mechanisms and regulations to enable things to be done.
I think that's useful.
And that would be enormously useful given the Australian Federation in which we need to operate.
Yeah, and clearly it has to be consensus-based, but there's a kind of an interesting parallel in the UK which you may be familiar with, but it's worth just exploring the characteristics of that in this topic a bit, because interestingly, it is a piece of new legislation that was enacted in the last, I think it was in April it came into law, which originally included in its scope health data, but for reasons we can unpack if you want, ultimately wasn't enacted. It includes health in its scope, but it does include all of the other ministries of state across the whole of England and Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. And so it was a piece of permissive law. So what was noted was that there were often sort of ministries or who may have had within their individual legislation that relates to them barriers for sharing of one sort or other. Perhaps, for example, a particular ministry couldn't share their data unless the project's subject was of direct benefit to themselves. And so this meant that their data couldn't be contributed to wider data linkage studies where the benefit might have contributed somewhere else. And this was seen as an impediment to getting the best value public benefit out of the data. So a piece of legislation which was enacted in the Digital Economy Act was created, and it covered a lot of ground. But in the bit that we're interested in, there was a piece of permission. So it essentially created a legal virus, a legal gateway that any government department or any jurisdiction could use if it so wished to legitimately and legally share their data for a public benefit. And there was a kind of description of what a public benefit was. So it kind of got them off the hook, which might have been local. They could still not participate if they wished to, but they didn't have a problem with the law because there was this overarching piece of legislation. And and during the consultation period, which I was part of, I was part of the sort of working with the drafting team of that for some period. What was proposed, I think largely to make sure that it was publicly acceptable, this kind of pan-government data linkage stuff, was actually a description of mechanism and the setting up of some statutory functions which would be the policeman of the whole. So that the public and indeed territories and states, which we don't have, jurisdictions, or ministries, which are in the UK almost as big and powerful as jurisdictions in many ways, and had legal problems, could rely on some third-party organisations which had real legal responsibilities given to them to police and operate the system. It was very broadly described, and actually in the UK that's now just being constructed. But I think it's an interesting precedent of how you put a piece of legislation in which doesn't displace privacy law, but provides a kind of gateway, an optional gateway, should a jurisdiction wish to use it to participate in things.
So in a sense it's enabling.
It's enabling
allows
legislation.
Something to happen. Well, that sounds very valuable, and it's possible that the Australian data sharing and release legislation will move into that sort of area. Yeah. So we're cautiously optimistic, but it's got to work. Obviously, it's being run through the federal government, and it needs to work through its processes.
Yeah. But of course, as we were saying earlier on, just dealing with the legal bit doesn't necessarily mean the complexity disappears. This complexity of custom and practice, policies and procedures that are institutionalised within the jurisdiction, all crafted, I'm sure, for very good reason. That exists in the UK too, but the difference is sometimes, real. It's more of an administrative issue, yes. But we certainly find that a lot.
So certainly we think there are opportunities to move towards common practice, or more standardised practice, so it's simplified and clarified. So when custodians have to make decisions about whether or not they approve a particular research project, they move through a sort of more standardised, structured process that is lawful and takes into account the various considerations, including the public good. I think, like the UK, we have this idea of public good, so this is large population data sets being used in the public interest, and there needs to be some determination, some understanding that actually this body of research is going to be beneficial for the community.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important consideration, and I know that certainly in the panels that you have that look at projects, you do have consumers represented. I think that's really important, and I think going forward that's going to become increasingly important. It's something that as technology changes, which it's doing rapidly, I think that it's still really important to ensure that the consumers and the community come along for that journey.
Yeah, so that would something that's been very dear to our hearts in Wales for some time. We've been doing this work, building a data bank, a repository model of data for well over 10 years now, and it didn't take us very long to realise that this could be perceived as sinister in some fractions of the population if they kind of got the wrong idea of what was happening and the protections that we had in place. So very early on, we were working very closely with consumers, and I know that's happened in Western Australia historically very deeply too. But I think it was really only relatively recently that some other parts of the UK and some other parts of organisations within the UK that really have sort of wised up to this, that this is we are producing public benefit. That's the raison d'etre of us all. But to do that in sort of without consulting with the public, without public understanding that we're doing this work on their behalf and using their personal data, ultimately processing it to make it safe, but ultimately it is their data. There should be some sort of compact with the public at large that gives us, we're not talking about consent to do that, we're not asking everybody their permission, but somehow they should understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, and should be relatively familiar and comfortable with the fact that we are and we're doing it well. And that's kind of was one of the artifacts that came out of that sort of new legislative change in the UK very recently, was that was going to have to be much more transparent than it's been happening before. So a mechanism to ensure that the public at large had an opportunity to, should they so wish. People are busy, not everybody wants to dive into our world, but should they so wish, they should be able to do so, and with transparency know exactly what's going on, who's doing what, why, all that sort of stuff. So I think that's very healthy, and it's an insurance for the future. If we really want to protect these data well, and to make sure they're used well and get the maximum public benefit, we need the public behind us, I think.